So this discussion is going to center around pain and pain relief. So what we're going to be talking about is the physiology of pain and kind of look at the overall pain experience that individuals have with injury. And some of this we've already gone over. We've covered the 3 levels of pain control and kind of briefly touched on some of the anatomy associated with this and the physiology associated with this in lab, but we're obviously going to get into a lot more depth here, looking at some of the different things that basically create the pain experience and also the different things we can do to kind of modulate the pain experience to help in reducing pain for our patients. So what we're going to do here is basically look at, starting out, kind of describe what pain is. And pain is actually, we think of it as a pretty simple thing to define, but yet if you have to define it, it's kind of hard to see. So you have to first look at all the different components of pain. So, we think of pain as a physical experience. We associate it with damage or injury of some sort, but there's actually more to it. So there's a couple different ways that you could define pain. First is a perception applied to nociceptive input. So nociceptive input is the actual physical signal of pain getting experienced by somebody. Another way to define it, as we have here, is an unpleasant sensory or emotional experience related to actual or potential tissue damage or described as such. So again, if you look at that second definition, you notice that it's an unpleasant sensory or emotional experience. So aside from just straight tissue damage, you also have some other factors that kind of regulate the pain experience. And we're going to talk about this. Even as it relates to rehabilitation, there are some instances where even without significant tissue damage, there's still pain getting experienced by our patients, and talk about ways how to deal with this. Obviously, pain has certain functions, and basically those functions all center around some sort of protection. So we'll talk about 3 overall functions of pain. The first one, as we all know, it lets us know that something is wrong. So when something hurts, we therefore know that there's something wrong in the body. So it's a signal to let us know there's something is wrong. That's the first one. The second one is a withdrawal mechanism. So the withdrawal mechanism, the simplest example of this, and it's in your textbook and reading, they talk about how, for instance, if you touch a hot pan on a stove, you immediately pull away from it. So that's a withdrawal response. And again, it's still a protective mechanism. It immediately tells you that, for instance, in that situation, if you don't remove your hand, you are going to damage tissue if you leave it on there for too long. And the third protective mechanism is basically protection through spasm. So we know that when we have injury or we have damage to an area of the body, the muscles will tend to splint the region through a protective spasm. Now, we also know that spasm is also going to be something that limits what we do during rehabilitation. So even though, again, it does protect the body, it does create some of the loss of function and also creates further pain. We talked about the pain-spasm, pain cycle. You have pain because of an injury, you have muscle spasm to protect it, that spasm produces more pain, and you just have this ongoing cycle. So those are your 3 functions. Lets you know something is wrong, withdrawal mechanism, protection through spasm. In looking at all this, because we're going to be looking at a lot of different things here, particularly, again, very similar to the information on inflammation and healing. We're going to be looking at a lot of anatomy and physiology here. So when you're kind of breaking down this discussion for studying purposes, just kind of a recommended way to go about doing this is, again, break it up this way, and this is essentially the way we're going to go through all of this. Understand the physiology. Understand all the influences that the neurological system is going to have on this. Again, pain is kind of a complex thing. It goes beyond just straight tissue damage. And again, and you've probably seen this in some of the individuals you dealt with at your clinical sites. You have some individuals who have let's say a moderate to severe types of injuries and don't really respond, emotionally the same way some people do with very minor injuries. And there's complicated reasons to describe that, some of which we're going to go over as we're going through this. That will take us into understanding the different types of nerve fibers, particularly as they relate to pain, touch, proprioception. So, and this is something that we touched on a little bit in lab already. We talked about certain pain fibers, and not only do we have certain pain fibers, but pain fibers responsible for transmitting certain types of pain. Pain from an acute traumatic injury, ankle sprain, hamstring strain, quad contusion, is a much different pain experience than something that somebody experiences through more of a chronic type injury with like an insidious or unknown onset of pain. So, and we're talking, and there's different pain fibers responsible for transmitting that information. And then the last, well, not necessarily the last thing, but then we're going to tie this all in again with the pain control theories, which we talked about. Those three levels of pain control, the level 1, level 2, and level 3, and the different areas that kind of modulate pain based on the type of pain control modalities you select. And again, we talked about how some modalities kind of fall into the different areas as far as regulating pain. So we all know that we have all these different modalities to regulate pain. So what we need to do is, again, looking at the goals of our treatments, understand what type of pain the patient's having and how long they've had the pain for, what caused the pain, because based on that is going to dictate which modality could possibly be a little bit more effective for relieving that pain. Now, looking at our neuroanatomy, so we're going to start looking at the anatomy and some of the physiology is just in regards to the nervous system itself, not even so much as it relates just specifically to pain. So when we look at this, the basic functional unit of our nervous system is the neuron. So in this picture in the upper right hand corner, we have a basic outline of a neuron with the components labeled. So the basic functional unit, the neuron, has different components, and some of this actually is stuff that we went over as well in ATR 310 when we talked about the neurological system. You have your dendrites, you have your cell body, you have your axon, and then you have the branches at the end, the little projections at the end of the axon and the terminals. So basically what all these different components do, the dendrites take information to the cell body, axons take information away from the cell body. And you can see the direction of signal flow, all of that is illustrated in the picture here. You also notice that there's a myelin sheath, which is basically a covering of the axon. The myelin sheath permits information to be transmitted faster. So nerves that do not have myelin sheaths do not transmit information as quickly as those that do. There's also different types of neurons, and they're basically classified by the number of branches that originate in the cell body. So you have either a unipolar neuron, which is basically one branch. You could have a bipolar neuron, which is two branches, or you could have a multipolar neuron, which is multiple branches. So unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, and that is, again, based on how many branches originate at the cell body. The other important structure here we're going to look at is the synapse. If you look at the other illustration, the synapse is basically the junction between two neurons. So it's where two neurons will actually communicate via your neurotransmitters, which are basically chemicals that get passed on between the axon of the presynaptic neuron and the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so we look at that neuron in the upper part. Again, your dendrites, your cell body, and your axons. If you look at the other picture, it's kind of showing the synapse between the two. You have an axon terminal, your little neurotransmitter molecules, and then your dendrites. And the neurotransmitters interact with the dendrite. There's a what they call a lock and key relationship. So if you look at what's going on in the picture there, basic representation, you have your neurotransmitter molecules getting released. So basically that chemical neurotransmitter is getting sent into the space. And if you look at the tip of the dendrites, you have those little spaces where the receptors basically fit in. That's the receptor sites. And one of two things happens when neurons communicate this way. You either have excitation, okay, or the postsynaptic neuron gets excited, or the postsynaptic neuron gets inhibited. So it either creates a response through excitation or it prevents a response based on inhibition. It just depends on the type of neurotransmitter or the type of response that's required from the postsynaptic neuron. Now with nerve fibers have a unidirectional transmission. Basically what that means is, and you're actually able to see this in the other picture, the information only flows in one direction. So that's basically the concept of unidirectional transmission, is that the information only goes in one direction. Most of the nerves in the peripheral nervous system are what are known as mixed nerves. Now what a mixed nerve means, it's basically a bundle of nerve fibers of different sizes. So when we refer to a lot of the nerves, we're going to be talking about as far as those nerves that that interact as far as the pain response goes, and also when we talk about electrical stim later on in the semester, we're going to talk about the idea of mixed nerves. And again, that's basically a mixed nerve is basically just a nerve, because again most of your nerves in the peripheral nervous system are basically just bundles of different nerve fibers. And then another component, which is kind of illustrated in the picture here, is a dorsal root ganglion. And basically what that is it's a nodule on the dorsal root of the spinal cord. And it contains cell bodies of afferent, which are sensory spinal neurons. So if you look in the picture, it's basically a cross-section of the spinal cord. You have your dorsal horn, your ventral horn. So ventral is front of the body, dorsal is the back. You have your dorsal nerve root, okay, which is coming from the posterior aspect of the spine. And then you have your dorsal root ganglion, which again is just that little nodule there that has all of those cell bodies. And again, those cell bodies are basically of afferent spinal neurons, which are basically sensory nerves in the nervous system. So continuing on looking at nerves, you have your sensory receptors, which are basically when you look at the sensory system. So when we look at the nervous system, we have sensory function and we have motor function. The first component of the sensory system, which is obviously going to be important as it relates to pain, are our actual sensory receptors. And there's different ways to classify different types of sensory receptors. The way we're basically going to be looking at, we're going to look at two different types of classifications. We're going to be looking at sensory receptors classified by location, and we're going to look at sensory receptors classified by the type of stimulus. So your sensory receptors based on location, we have a couple different types here. We have your exteroreceptors, which are receptors located near the surface of the skin. So these are receptors close to the surface of the skin. They're sensitive to stimulus outside of the body. So your sensory receptors that are close to the skin would be classified as exteroreceptors. Your interoreceptors are located internally. So the interoreceptors are essentially stimulated from stimuli coming from the visceral organs and the blood vessels. Okay, so again, exteroreceptors close to the surface of the skin, sensitive to stimulus outside the body. Interoreceptors are located internally, and they're responsible for stimuli from the visceral organs, or your organs in the blood vessels. Then we have our proprioceptors, which are sensory receptors located in our skeletal muscles, in our joints, our ligaments, and tendons. So all of the musculoskeletal structures of the body contain different types of what are called proprioceptors. So again, those are the three classifications based on location. Then we have classification based upon the type of stimulus that the nerves detect. So we have first our mechanoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors are responsible for basically physical force. So for instance, touch, pressure, stretch are all different things that mechanoreceptors. So for instance, when a muscle gets stretched, the mechanoreceptors are responsible for sensing that mechanical stimulus. So, think about, again, whether it would be, pressure in the body, stretch in the body, even movement obviously would fall under this, or all. So think of mechanical stress would be sensed by your mechanoreceptors. Photoreceptors are receptive to light. Okay, photoreceptors, so photo is representative of light. Thermoreceptors would be responsible for sensing temperature changes, and chemoreceptors respond to chemicals, particularly during like sensations of taste and smell. Also changes in the body's chemistry. So for instance, we know that we have certain levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood, for instance. The chemoreceptors are responsible for noting changes in the concentrations in carbon dioxide and oxygen in the blood. So again, your two basic classifications, location and stimulus, based upon where they're at, what type of stimuli the sensory nerves are basically stimulated with. Now, so we looked at a lot of the neuroanatomy of the peripheral nervous system, looking at the nerves, the different types of nerves, the neuron, all the different functional units. Now we're going to look at the central nervous system. So in the central nervous system, and the picture illustrated here, we have a basic outline of the brain and the different components. We're going to talk about specific areas of the brain as it relates to some of the things we're going to be discussing. So we have first looking at this, one of the labeled parts, we have the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is responsible for a couple different things. It's responsible for a lot of the function of our autonomic nervous system. So this little area in the brain is responsible for, regulating a good portion of the autonomic nervous system, which is the part of the nervous system that we don't voluntarily control. It also works on our motivational states, and it's also a basic central control region within the brain. So looking down here, we then have the cerebral cortex, which is the outer part of the brain. A lot of different functions here, basically coordinates and determines the location of pain and the intensity of pain. So that whole outer region of the cerebral cortex, again, is going to let us know where pain is basically located. So in other words, when you have an injury, your body basically knows something is wrong, but doesn't know where it's wrong until the cerebral cortex gets to basically determine where the actual location of pain is. So it'll kind of let you know where it is, kind of regulates pain intensity, and it also initiates the descending control of pain. So one of the things we're going to talk about, the different levels of pain control, the descending pain control mechanism actually it is initiated by the cerebral cortex. Then kind of interacting with the brain and the spinal cord, you have your tracks or your pathways. And what they basically are is that your tracks and pathways are bundles of nerves in the central nervous system. And you have two different types. You have descending tracks and you have ascending tracks. So descending tracks transmit information from the brain down the spinal cord. Ascending tracks transmit information up the spinal cord to the brain. So two different types of tracks within this based upon the type of information and what that's going to be responsible for. So again, basically just a bundle of nerve fibers in the central nervous system. Then looking further at the neuroanatomy, we have our white and gray matter. So neurons are basically gray in color, and you see a good example of white matter, gray matter when you look at that's basically a cross section of the spinal cord in the picture in the lower part of the screen. And the gray matter are basically neurons that do not have a myelin sheath. So when you see white matter, the white matter are basically your myelinated neurons. So when you look at the cross section of the spinal cord, you kind of look at it, it looks like it has two horns, and the significance of those structures will be discussed. You have a dorsal horn. So again, dorsal is the posterior portion of the spine, and you have the ventral horn, which is the anterior portion. And what basically is going to be going on there is on the dorsal or the posterior horn, that's where the afferent nerves or your sensory nerves enter the spinal cord, and the ventral or the anterior horn is where the efferent nerves or your motor nerves exit the spinal cord. So afferent, sensory through the dorsal, efferent, motor through the ventral horn. And then you also have what's called an interneuron. And an interneuron is a neuron that's completely located in the central nervous system. It basically connects the afferent and efferent neurons. So it's basically the interneuron is essentially the relay between the two when there's communication going on. And the interneuron has the ability to either produce an excitatory response or inhibitory response based upon the function of the input coming into the different nerves. Looking further at the anatomy of the central nervous system, as we talked about with the nervous system, you have a breakdown of the autonomic and the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, again, which is the involuntary component of the central nervous system, you have your two components. You have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic components, which again was something discussed last year. The sympathetic being the flight or fight response that we have with our nervous system, causes the increase in heart rate, increase in respiration rate, blood flow, getting diverted to the muscles, pupils dilating. Then you have the parasympathetic side, that's the rest and digest component, basically what our body should be at rest. Again, slower heart rate, slower respiration, obviously a major component in digestion, as the kind of nickname to the system implies. The other part of our central nervous system is the somatic nervous system, and the somatic nervous system again is our kind of our voluntary control. And again, two components of that, you have your afferent and your efferent nerves. Your afferent are your sensory nerves, your efferent are your motor nerves. And in relationship to the spinal cord, The afferent nerves come in through what's known as the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. The efferent nerve exit via the ventral horn, okay, the dorsal being the posterior, the ventral being the anterior side of the spinal cord. So the afferent information, or the sensory information, leads into the spinal cord via the dorsal horn. The efferent information comes out via the ventral horn. And again, you can see the two different representations of the spinal cord on this slide. Now looking at the peripheral nervous system, so basically we're looking at any nerves that kind of leave the central nervous system to go and interact with the rest of the body. You have your cranial nerves, which basically are the nerves that interact directly with the brain. Two examples of sensory cranial nerves given by the textbook are your optic nerves and your auditory nerves. So your optic nerves are the nerves that allow you to see. The auditory nerves are those that allow you to hear. Then you have your sensory nerves and your somatic motor nerves. So your sensory nerves basically go from the periphery and enter into the central nervous system. And again, they will carry information to the central nervous system and deliver it via the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. And then your somatic motor nerves go from the CNS, the central nervous system, and go out to the skeletal muscles. So they go out to their respective skeletal muscles to basically, cause voluntary muscle contraction. And then the last one's up here, the autonomic motor nerves. They basically go from the central nervous system to the smooth muscle and cardiac system. Again, remember, your smooth muscles are the nerves, for instance, are the muscles that basically, for instance, in a lot of your vital organs, coordinate function with those with those regions. And so this slide basically just shows you kind of an overall summary of all of the major elements and structures within the nervous system. So breaking everything down from the central nervous system, going down to the peripheral nervous system, and then all the other divisions within that, kind of discussing both the structures and the functions. So for instance, that you look up at the top, kind of the hierarchy, the central nervous system, the structures being the brain and spinal cord, the functions being integrative and control centers. The peripheral nervous system, the structures being the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves, communication lines between the CNS and the rest of the body, and so forth and so forth. So take a look at this this kind of flow chart as far as it goes. Basically, again, it's essentially a summary of what we just went over, just kind of showing how all the different structures interact and what the individual functions are. Now here we have representation of what is the pain pathway. So again, we've talked about the process of inflammation and some of the things that kind of cause pain through that. Now we're strictly looking at this from a nervous system component and kind of how the pain pathway kind of travels. So looking at this picture, you see at the bottom by the foot, it's essentially picture somebody having dropped something on their toe, if you will, be an easy way to see this. Again, we know that when we have a physical injury, we have physical trauma, and you get obviously both tissue damage. Also, you also get chemical release, and all of these things signal pain. Okay, so essentially the first order neuron is the sensory nerve that takes information from the periphery to the spinal cord. Okay, so the first order neuron transmits sensory information from the receptor to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Again, the sensory nerves enter the spinal cord via the dorsal horn. And you could follow this up. You then have your second order neurons, which basically transmits information from those sensory pathways to the thalamus in the brain. So we're now going basically from the spinal cord to the thalamus. And it's at that point where that second order neuron travels starting from the dorsal horn up to the thalamus that you know that you have pain, but you don't know where yet. So in other words, when the pain signal's at that point in the pain pathway, your body knows something is injured but doesn't know where yet. That's where then the third order neuron, which basically transmits information from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. It's at that point where then your body is able to say, for instance in this situation, that the injury happened at the toe. So you now officially know, once it hits that third order neuron, the thalamus, okay, so the third order neuron is in the thalamus, it relays information to the cerebral cortex. So all of these different parts of this pathway are basically responsible for different things. So the three levels that basically happens here, your first order neuron is your sensory reception, your second order neuron is your ascending pathway, and then your third order neurons are going to be responsible for eventually allowing for central processing within the higher regions of the brain. So now looking at some of the different classifications of specific sensory nerves, particularly as they relate to the pain experience, you have your A delta fibers. These are A delta nerve fibers. These are responsible for both pain, for pain, crude touch, and temperature. So they will transmit information about all of those different functions. They are slightly myelinated, and they do transmit information rather fast, versus the type C fibers, which also transmit pain. They're responsible for pain, temperature, pressure, and touch. The type C fibers are a little smaller. They're non-myelinated, so they don't have the myelin sheath, so they transmit information slowly. Both of these are, obviously, since I had said they both transmit pain, both of them are nociceptors. So both of these transmit pain. Now, just going by the description, if you think about your different type of injuries and the pain experience with them, it's your A delta fibers that carry that more acute type pain that you experience with your acute traumatic injuries, your sprains, your strains, dislocations, fractures, what have you. Again, the information in those nerves travel much faster versus your type C fibers, which are more responsible for your chronic type pain. So, if you think of, the descriptors for chronic type pain, dull, aching, those types of descriptors, it is that sensation that is carried by the C fibers. Looking further at some other sensory nerves, your A alpha nerves, they're responsible for both touch and motor function. So the A alpha actually has motor function as well. They are the largest and the fastest of all of the classification of the peripheral nerves. And they have a lot of general functions, particularly, again, as it relates to motor function, a much greater motor function than any of the other nerves. The other nerves are all, that we're talking about, are all sensory nerves. And then we also have the A beta, which are also sensory nerves. A beta nerves are responsible for touch and kinesthesia. So the A beta sensory nerve is a sensory nerve of general touch. It does not transmit pain, and this is going to become important when we look at our levels of pain control. One of our levels of pain control actually uses the A beta fiber. It's a general, again, general touch, general kinesthesia. That A beta fiber is going to be responsible for one of our levels of pain control that we're going to be talking about. And this is, again, looking at just some different classifications. We kind of talked about this before already, but just to kind of review, your mechanoreceptors and proprioceptors are both sensory-based nerve endings. Your mechanoreceptors are typically more superficial, whereas your proprioceptors are more deep sensory fibers. Your thermoreceptors obviously are going to be responsible for temperature. Now, an interesting thing with the thermoreceptors, usually as far as the thermoreceptors go, the thermoreceptors are only responsible for warmth to a certain point, because obviously once warmth takes itself so far, it basically causes pain with a burn. So when you experience a burn, when something burns you, it's at that point that the temperature is no longer carried via thermoreceptors. It's then obviously going to be carried by the next group of nerve endings, are your nociceptors, or your pain receptors, which we talked about in particular. The A delta and C fibers are the two main nociceptors that we discuss in regards to pain control. So again, in looking at sources of pain, when we look at the inflammation process, we know that there's various things that cause pain. Again, the actual damage to tissue itself, which obviously is going to, again, damage nerve fibers in the process. Also, the chemicals of inflammation, particularly bradykinin, is one of the chemicals that gets released that causes stimulation of the nociceptor or the pain nerve endings. When we look at orthopedic causes, primarily our orthopedic causes of pain are chemical or mechanical and chemical. Mechanical being the actual trauma to tissue, chemical being the chemicals that get released once that happens. Our two other causes of pain that we talked about, we also talked about thermal stimulus and electrical stimulus, which can both cause pain as well. Obviously, they're not really orthopedic causes of pain. In looking at some of the characteristics of pain, acute versus chronic pain, again, if you think of the way that these two different types of pain are typically described, typically when you talk about acute pain, sharp, stinging, those are the types of descriptors when they talk about acute pain. Again, the nociceptors that are responsible for acute pain are going to be your A delta fibers. Okay, so they're more sensitive to the mechanical displacement of tissue, and they're a little bit more, as your book describes it, high threshold, versus chronic pain, which is going to be carried by your unmyelinated, smaller C fibers. And, again, they don't carry the same type of pain. And again, if you think of injuries that are more chronic in nature or have a more insidious onset, meaning that there's no particular day. If someone sprains their ankle, they can usually tell you when they sprained their ankle. If someone just develops, say anterior knee pain, they usually don't remember a particular day when it started. They might remember that it happened 1 or 2 weeks ago, but they don't know a particular day. So you're usually looking at pain being associated with those injuries as being carried by your type C fibers. And then you also have your referred versus radiating pain. Referred pain refers to pain from a site, pain referred to a site other than the actual trauma. You actually tend to see this a lot when you have injuries to, say, your visceral organs. We talked about this. For instance, the spleen causing referred pain in the left shoulder is an example of that. So that would be an example of referred pain. Now, this is in contrast to radiating pain. So referred and radiating aren't the same thing. Radiating pain emanates from an irritated nerve root. So this is something you see a lot of times with, say, herniated discs, where the herniated disc comes out, it presses on a dorsal root ganglion on the spinal nerve roots, and it causes that kind of shooting, radiating pain down through a nerve because of that irritation that takes place. So again, understand our basic causes of orthopedic pain, the difference characteristics, again, which we've talked about many times between acute and chronic pain and what carries that, and then looking at the differences between referred and radiating pain. So here's where we start to look at the theory behind how we sense pain and kind of how we look to control pain. And it's important to know, we're going to be talking about some theories that are kind of outdated, but at the same time kind of laid the framework for where some of this information started and came from, and it kind of helped us to get where we're at with some of our current modern day pain control mechanisms. The specificity theory was one of the early theories of how we experience pain. Essentially what this theory has explained by is that it was believed at one time that there are specific nociceptors in the periphery, meaning like throughout our body we had all these like specific pain endings, and anytime one of them was stimulated, we basically experience pain. So what basically we looked at with this was that there was a direct connection between the pain that we experienced and the body part that we were looking at. Now, one of the weaknesses that came to this was that one of the things that couldn't be explained was what's known as phantom limb pain. And what phantom limb pain is in an individual that has a body limb amputated, there are people who actually experience pain in the limb that's amputated. In other words, their body is actually telling them. For instance, if you have an amputee who had their right arm amputated, well, they still experience pain as if they actually had the arm. And it's actually a very difficult thing to treat, but that was one of the things that couldn't really be explained through this specificity theory. So in other words, we didn't really find that there was no direct connection, that there aren't these specific receptors that we once thought that they had. Now, this certainly doesn't discount the fact that we do have specific types of receptors throughout the body, but there's not this direct connection between a receptor and pain. In other words, there's other things that could kind of go on to experience this. Plus, another thing is just kind of the overall psychology, kind of the affective, emotional component of pain wasn't really explained by the specificity theory. So the next thing they all kind of looked at was the pattern theory. So what the pattern theory kind of looked at is that when the pain occurs, and basically when the rate and pattern of sensory input, so in other words, once sensory input exceeds a threshold, what they felt was that that's what caused you to experience pain. So, you have an injury or a trauma happen, and what essentially happens is the nerves, basically the input to those nerves exceeds a threshold and you experience pain. Part of the problem with this theory is that they basically found it to be way too general. It doesn't really account for the high degree of receptor specialization that we have through our body. If you think about all the different nerve receptors we just talked about, and even in particular, some very specific sensory nerves, for instance, like the eyes send information via the optic nerve, which is a very specialized nerve ending obviously for us to work for our vision. So again, some decent ideas out of it. Obviously, we know that certain nerves do have threshold points, but the overall theory was just too general, and it didn't account for some of the specificity that we do have.
Now, the next theory we're going to look at, and this one pertains to some of the more common pain control theories, the gate theory. And the gate theory basically took kind of a combination of the two previous theories that we talked about, kind of took the specificity and the pattern theory, and took what would essentially be the good parts of them and looked at the fact of the pain control mechanism and how it operates at the level of the spinal cord. And it proposes a gate mechanism. Now again, some of this should start to sound familiar as we sort of covered this concept in lab. So the gate mechanism, as it's kind of laid out, is located in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and the idea here is that only one sensation is allowed to pass through the brain at a time. So now you have to start thinking about those different sensory nerve endings that we had talked about previously, because that's where the interaction is going to take place between those different sensory nerves and the structures located at the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. So looking at the relevant structures as far as how this kind of takes place, the dorsal horn gray matter is basically where a lot of these structures are going to interact, and basically is the area where pain inhibition takes place. And you have two different structures. You have your T cell, which your T cell is essentially the gate that the gate theory is referring back to, because that's going to be what transmits information to the brain to be basically, essentially, when you have an injury, is what the brain determines is pain, as illustrated down there. And again, that's going to be the pain carried by those small fibers. So take, for instance, an acute injury. The A delta fibers, your small pain fibers, are going to take that information. It's going to go to the dorsal horn in the spinal cord, and the T cell, or what's also known as the transmission cell, is going to take that to the brain, where it then is going to be interpreted. There's a structure located in the dorsal horn of the gray matter in the spinal column known as the substantia gelatinosa. The substantia gelatinosa is the structure that, if stimulated by other large sensory fibers, so an example of another large sensory fiber would be those A beta fibers. You stimulate those A beta fibers, it basically interferes with the pain transmission. It causes the substantia gelatinosa to close the gate, if you will, to the pain. So this is very similar to that ascending pain control, or that level 1 pain control that we had discussed in lab. Again, here we see a breakdown of the structures and kind of how this works. So the substantia gelatinosa, again, large fibers stimulate. So we look at the A beta fibers stimulating the structure. Small fibers inhibit. So the small pain fibers inhibit it. So ideally, if we look to control pain this way, we look to try to find some type of modality that will stimulate the substantia gelatinosa to close the gate. So this is all responses to pain that involves this, is kind of concentrated around this concept. Now, another thing to look at is central control. This is kind of the other part to this. Again, we talk about the overall pain experience. In discussing central control, inhibiting or facilitating pain, this kind of then influences how one interprets pain. So the central control concept, again, kind of goes beyond just the actual structural damage that occurs because of the injury. And this kind of also goes on to influence kind of how pain possibly that happens in the future, kind of how the body kind of deals with it. Again, if you look at the picture in the bottom there, just kind of again illustrates the relationship between the large and small fibers, the substantia gelatinosa, and the T cell. Again, the large fibers will stimulate the substantia gelatinosa to close the gate and decrease the sensation of pain, whereas the small fibers will allow the gate to remain open, if you will, to sensing pain. And this is where we essentially got our idea to start using TENS, or transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, for pain reduction. This is, again, we talked about this. This is another thing we talked about in lab, and we gave kind of the demonstration with stim. TENS is the sensory-based stim, or is commonly used for sensory-based stim. It's basically, so if you've had TENS done to you, you know what it feels like. It's the strong pins and needles kind of tingling type of stim, if you will. And that's essentially what happens when you use TENS with the gate theory, is that sensory TENS stimulates the A beta fibers to then close off the gate to pain. Now, there's some deficiencies as far as the gate theory and the implementation of this is. One of them is it cannot account for chronic pain syndromes. So, you know, for different chronic-based pain syndromes, not necessarily long-standing acute injury that gets re-aggravated, but more chronic pain, it doesn't really account for kind of how the pain from that is perceived and controlled. It also doesn't explain why some stimuli can cause pain over time. So it does, again, account for a lot of the initial pain and things of that nature, but it doesn't account for how a stimulus can cause pain over a longer period of time. It also doesn't explain how placebos work, and we're going to talk about the idea behind placebos and how those types of treatments can possibly influence pain. Another thing that it does not look at is the influence of drugs. So, for instance, the stronger pain-relieving drugs that we take, it doesn't quite explain how those types of drugs relieve our pain. So while it does account for some types of pain relief and how we experience pain, it's obviously still incomplete as far as how we can stop pain through other mechanisms. Now, again, we talked about it. We obviously know that drugs are used for pain relief, and obviously you don't have the same pain relief mechanism if you do have with the gate theory. Obviously, with drugs, you have a much greater widespread response. So, in looking at this and how drugs relieve pain, a lot of this comes back to, again, that neurophysiology that we talked about at the beginning of this discussion. So if you look at the picture, we have a receptor. So if you remember looking at the little picture of the synapse, the junction between the two communicating nerves that we had within the body earlier on in this discussion, all of them have little receptors. Again, you have that little lock and key relationship. So looking quite simply, for instance, a drug like morphine, obviously a very, very strong pain-relieving drug, part of the reason why morphine exerts the effects it does is because it basically completely blocks pain receptors. So it's a little different as far as the anatomy involved and the structures involved in pain relief, but it's just kind of another level as far as how pain can be relieved, or another mechanism by which it can be relieved. So if you look at the picture here, simple representation of a receptor, so that would be, for instance, if we were looking at the full neuron, that would be the receptor on your dendrites. The morphine, basically, when you take it, fills those receptors. So you see the little neurotransmitter at the bottom. Basically what's going to happen here is that morphine is going to fill that receptor. The pain neurotransmitter isn't going to be able to utilize that. So it's essentially blocking, the pharmacology here is basically when you have these strong pain relieving drugs, this is essentially what they do. They look to fill those pain receptors and prevent that. Now that also will bring us then to some other ideas, besides using drugs and the gate theory as pain relief, because we know of certain chemicals in the body that can be utilized for this same purpose. Research with this has kind of led us in a lot of different directions, and in studies, scientists have used a substance called naloxone, which they found reverses a lot of the pain relief in humans. Now they found that it's basically a morphine antidote, and what they found is that, for instance, with acupuncture, obviously acupuncture doesn't use any drugs, but what they found is when they've given patients naloxone, if they experience pain relief with acupuncture and then their pain comes back, that kind of led people to start to think that, well, then there must be pain relieving substances in the body that has a similar chemical component that these drugs that we take have. And what essentially that ended up doing was allowing for the discovery of natural pain relieving substances in the body. So our body actually has these different natural pain relieving substances that can be utilized, and again, we could allow them to operate by applying different types of modalities. So a couple of these pain relieving substances that occur in the body, the first one we're talking about is enkephalin, and enkephalin operates at the spinal cord level. It's produced by the brain, spinal cord, and GI tract, but it operates and functions at the spinal cord level. And what they've found with this is it actually caused the gate control theory to be kind of modified a little bit. So the original gate theory still had truth as far as the interaction between the large and small fibers, but what they've also discovered is that enkephalin also works to block the gate when you stimulate the gate theory mechanism when you do this. So all it basically changed with it was now we also have this chemical structure in the body that also does this as well. Again, it's found in the brain, spinal cord, and gastrointestinal tract, but it operates at the spinal cord level. So it doesn't circulate throughout the body. It basically all works at the spinal cord level. The other thing with this is its half-life is only a few seconds, meaning that it doesn't operate for a very long period of time. So basically for instance, your low intensity sensory TENS or even a gentle type of massage will cause this to be released. The thing is, once that TENS is no longer being utilized or the massage is over, the half-life of it basically won't last very long. So the pain relief after the modality is removed is very minimal. Our next chemical structure to look at is endorphins, and endorphins are essentially morphine-like molecules. They're produced at the pituitary gland in the brain. The good thing about endorphins is that they act over a longer time span, and they act at several different areas. So the half-life of these are much longer. Its half-life is almost 4 hours, and they exist in different forms. The most common one are what are known as beta endorphins, and again, they act at different areas. Your modalities that release these are acupuncture, very high intensity noxious TENS, and actually intense exercise. You've probably heard of endorphin release with exercise. It is proven that intense exercise releases endorphins as well. Some other structures, your serotonin is a neurotransmitter that influences pain perception. Serotonin is primarily utilized through a descending mechanism. So it's a chemical messenger that, again, much like enkephalin is found in different areas, but it influences pain through a descending mechanism, from the brain going down to the spinal cord, and inhibits the pain receptors in that way. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter, but influences some different things. It influences the emotional response and both the ability to experience pleasure and pain. So the take-home point with dopamine is that primarily it looks to kind of regulate the emotional response to pain. Pain perception. So we're going to look at the idea of pain versus pain perception. Again, when you're strictly looking at pain is just strictly the response to an impulse. So again, we've discussed this before. If someone has a sprained ankle, again, the body perceives the pain because of the tissue damage that occurs and usually the intensity and duration of the pain is attributed to just the straight amount as far as the amount of damage that was done is equivalent typically to the amount of pain that someone experiences. So that's what we look at as being acute pain. Now, as the healing process occurs, you gradually start to decrease your pain. However, in the situation that if for whatever reason persistent pain lingers, okay, ideally throughout the healing progression pain starts to decrease. If for whatever reason that pain kind of sticks around and lingers, you gradually start to get increased sensitivity to the pain, and the central nervous system then starts to basically become more sensitive and starts to activate other areas that are utilized in the pain response. In other words, your second order neurons and your interneurons become activated to the point where the idea of pain starts to change, and that's where you get the transition to what we experience with chronic pain. So again, chronic pain is a very different thing than acute pain perception. So acute pain perception is tissue damage, pain. Okay, again, structural damage, chemical release causes acute pain. If the pain tends to persist and linger, you will then start to get processes that lead to the development of chronic pain, which is going to be driven by other things other than just the structure. So we look at things like genetic factors, psychosocial factors, memories as far as past pain experiences and things we've had. That type of pain experience is then going to kind of drive how we look at or how we perceive our chronic pain. So again, acute pain strictly looks at the structural and chemical issues. Chronic pain issues, if they persist, will start to look at different types of noxious input based upon psychological factors, past experience, and some other things that people have dealt with in the past in regards to pain.